Hey, and welcome to this week's edition of Road to the White House. Each week at this time, we take an hour and a half to look at what the announced and unannounced candidates for president are doing and saying around the country. This week, former Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt delivers a foreign policy speech in Iowa. We'll speak with Scott Reed, Midwestern Regional Political Director for the Kemp campaign. And finally, Representative Jack Kemp, Republican of New York and a candidate for the Republican Party's nomination for president, speaks at a foreign affairs conference in Washington, D.C. Our first stop this week is the Congregational Church in Iowa City, Iowa. The local Foreign Affairs Council held a luncheon recently. The chief speaker for the day was Democratic presidential candidate Bruce Babbitt.
What I'd like to do today is talk briefly, well, not so briefly really, about this issue of arms control, because I believe that we're now at the threshold of an extraordinary opportunity, and that it's time to take the issue of arms control away from the technicians, away from all of the metaphysicians and theoreticians, and get it out in the sunlight of public opinion, so that in 1988 we can have a real debate, not so much about all the technical stuff, but about the opportunity and indeed the very future of the relations between America and the Soviet Union and the fate of the world. I think we have to talk about arms control from a premise about what's happening in the relations between America and the Soviet Union and what will happen over the next couple of decades. My view of the world is radically different from the premise of the president. The president's foreign policy is one that's based upon fear. It's based upon a worldview of 1953. He's a man who believes that America is besieged, that the forces of history are conspiring against us, that every time a sparrow falls from a tree anywhere in the world, it's evidence of a conspiracy arrayed against us in which America is losing. And I must tell you, he couldn't be more wrong. I see a world undergoing a revolutionary change in which American ideals are now in the ascendancy, in which market economics are taking root all over Asia. Japan is an American success story. That success is now sweeping across Asia. I was in Beijing sometime about a year ago to hear the Chinese leaders telling me that Marxism is dead, that they know that Marxism is a discredited economic theory, once a contagious, visionary ideology, hasn't worked, now on the scrap heap of history. And behind the economic liberalization, which now is taking momentum, will inevitably come a demand for political freedom. It's a worldview which acknowledges reality. The tides of revolution are running deep. Time is on our side. The forces of history and economics pose a world full of hope, optimism, and change. Now, President Reagan doesn't acknowledge it. He sees a worldview of fear, of loss, of paranoia. And it leads to one tragedy after another in Lebanon, in the Persian Gulf, in Central America, and lost opportunities all over because he fails to see how it is we can carry this to flood tide by doing what we've done so well in the past. There's a bipartisan consensus for arms control, for international economics, for democracy, for American values. Now, when I say Marxism is dead, there is one world leader who agrees with me, and his name is Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev understands that Marxism is dead, and that creates his dilemma. That creates his inward look at the Soviet Union. He's caught in the riptides of world history, turning inward to ask how he can salvage and recreate a society that's based on a series of false premises. I don't know how that internal struggle will turn out or what shape it will eventually take. But I know this. It poses a momentous opportunity to come together on these issues of arms control. Because I understand his motives. He needs space. He needs economic resources devoted to internal reform, an opportunity of unprecedented magnitude for the United States of America. It was the opportunity that we had at Reykjavik. Now, President Reagan went to Iceland for the wrong reason. He went to cover up the ransom for Danelaw. He went for a photo opportunity on short notice with no agenda, with much of the staff opposed completely to the whole concept of arms control. They met in a haunted house for a long weekend. And something nearly extraterrestrial happened across that weekend, because through inadvertence, happenstance, the times, together they came within 10 yards of the most momentous summit in the entire history of the nuclear age. And at the last minute, the president lost his nerve and walked away. Now, since then, we have come to our senses in Europe, and we're now on the threshold of an INF treaty of some importance. We should celebrate that fact. But we must take the president at his word when he says it's just a beginning, because it is only a beginning. It doesn't get near the real issues in the nuclear stalemate between the Soviet Union and the United States. And we must go back to Reykjavik with a clear consensus agenda for the important items. The first one is Star Wars. We've got to stuff that genie back in the bottle before it gets out and triggers the most apocalyptic arms race of all time. We all know that. The president told us that Star Wars was a perfect astrogram, but it isn't. And he knows that it isn't. And if it's less than perfect, it's fuel for an offensive arms race of ever larger weapon systems to overwhelm the other side's defenses. If we have Star Wars, the Soviet Union will have Star Wars. That's the absolutely ironclad lesson of the arms race. Then it will become even more destabilizing with a premium for the first side that makes a preemptive attack to destroy the system of the other side, thereby paving the way for a successful first strike. We must, through renegotiating, adhering to the ABM treaty, putting together new protocols to define testing and development, to prohibit anti-satellite weapon systems, get a handle on that monster before it's too late. We then need to seal the deal with a comprehensive test ban treaty. It's beyond dispute that we have the capacity all over this world to verify a test ban treaty, down to a threshold of no more than a kiloton of size. And it's in the manifest interest of both sides to get that treaty. The resistance in Washington comes from a clique of people who don't want a treaty because they want to proceed with the testing of nuclear X-ray lasers for the Star Wars system. And I say to them, come on out and admit your reasons so we can have a debate about it and form a consensus for a real test ban treaty. There are other issues. The reduction of offensive weapons is a real possibility, a possibility that we must seize with creative negotiation and understand that the offers that Gorbachev put on the table in Iceland, which the president characterized as suspect because of their origin, were really in their true origin American proposals that must now be brought back for negotiation and for successful agreements. Now, what I'd like to do today is talk about what I think is the next and most difficult issue of all. The things that I've just discussed you've heard about. We're debating. We'll be talking about them at StarPAC on Sunday. They're familiar issues, and I submit that all Democrats will be in agreement about both the opportunity arising out of the historical change that I described, and that we will together be advocating those policies. But there's one other problem. It's neglected, and it's perhaps the most dangerous one of all. you were to survey our military planners and you ask them how they thought a nuclear war might begin, their answer would be none of the things that I've talked about, the first strike scenarios, terrorism, accidents. They would tell you that a nuclear war is most likely to begin with a series of tactical nuclear explosions in Central Europe. And they would tell you that the first nuclear weapons to explode would be American nuclear weapons. There's a simple reason for that. It is the stated policy of the United States of America to use nuclear weapons first, whether the Soviets have used them or not, whenever we think it, quote, necessary, close quote, in wartime. Now, most Americans find that hard to accept, and a lot find it hard to believe. Fact remains that we are prepared to start, to initiate a nuclear war. Not only what we say, we actually intend that policy, because by our own deliberate actions, we haven't left ourselves with any choice. Now, it's true that Reagan and Gorbachev will soon sign an agreement to eliminate intermediate and short-range nuclear missiles in Europe. But the nuclear arsenal we commit to the defense of Europe is going to be reduced only by the tiniest fraction. There will remain literally thousands of nuclear weapons, bombs, artillery shells, all of which have been integrated into the NATO's defense plan, in which local military commanders expect to use in time of war. Last week, General John Galvin, who is the Supreme Allied Commander, said that if war broke out in Europe, and I quote, we would reach a critical point on the battlefield within a matter of days in which the war would go nuclear. Now, General Galvin wasn't really saying anything that remarkable, because that's in fact been NATO's doctrine for many years. And I believe that that doctrine must change. There are currently two ideas behind America's first use plan, and they're directly contradictory. There's a paradox. On the one hand, our policy has been to try to make the prospect of war in Europe so horrible that no one would ever actually think of starting. In that way, the threat to go nuclear amounts to a suicide pact between America and NATO. That view has at least the virtue of being accurate. On the other hand, we've designed and deployed thousands of nuclear devices to perform tactical military missions, to destroy small enemy targets, airstrips, tank formations, on the assumption that nuclear warheads were just like any other kind of weapon. We put out technical manuals that call for, and I quote, selective, discriminate, restrained nuclear strikes as part of selective employment packages, they call them, SEPs. We persist in the illusion that we can use these nuclear weapons and yet avoid a nuclear war. I submit to you that a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon, whether it's tactical or strategic. It makes the same mushroom cloud. It generates the same blast and heat and radiation. And it's as true today as it's always been that we don't have any idea how to stop a nuclear war once it has started. And I reject the view that we can use these tactical weapons with surgical precision and without the risk of triggering the annihilation of mankind. Now, if that first use strategy is to be defended, it's defended as a suicide pact, as a promise to our European allies that we'd sooner destroy the whole world than risk a loss in a conventional war. Now, the people who advocate that suicide pact say, by way of defense, they say, well, it works. It's preserved the peace in Europe for nearly 40 years. All of that time we've threatened to use nuclear weapons in a European war, and the war has not begun. That's true. But consider this. It only has to stop working once. Only once. Now, I submit that you have time after you pull the pin from a hand grenade to say, see, I told you it was harmless. You also have time put the pin in, and I believe that's what we have to do. One day, sooner or later, for some fathomless, deliberate reason or by inadvertence, we may find ourselves in an armed conflict in Europe. And if that bluff fails, if deterrence doesn't work, we need options other than starting a nuclear war. Between the United States and NATO, we have more wealth, more technology, more people, and vastly more industrial power than the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And I think it's nonsense to have a policy which says we're incapable of defending ourselves in a conventional war except by initiating the use of nuclear weapons. For 20 years, NATO has outspent the Warsaw Pact. Our forces are highly trained. They're motivated. They're politically loyal, which is more than can be said for the other side. And the mission of defense, which is the premise of NATO, is inherently easier than assumptions about offense. We have a technological edge in most armament categories. Now, I concede there are some categories in which the Warsaw Pact is a hit. But what our military analysts tell us is that those gaps can be bridged, that we need not rely upon the threat and the policy of starting a nuclear war. If I become president, it will be the policy of the United States to arrange its military affairs on the assumption that we will never be the first to use nuclear weapons in any conflict. Now, that's a direct reversal of the planning assumptions that has governed our military policy in Europe under every president since Dwight Eisenhower. Now, I'm not particularly interested in a declaration of no first use, because declarations are words. What I'm interested in is action, in how it is we change our capabilities and intentions, and how it is our military services can prepare a defense that is based on the assumption that those weapons don't exist. It's a goal. It's a radically different goal, and we can't reach it without some significant changes in the way we view defense, the kinds of weapons we buy, and the strategies we deploy. But I believe that we can and we must reach that goal within the life of the next administration. The bottom line is this. The Reagan administration has offered the wrong kind of initiative for Americans' defense. They want a strategic defense initiative that increases the risk of a nuclear war. I'd try to substitute a conventional defense initiative that makes that war less likely. Now, some of you may ask, well, isn't your proposal, doesn't it really amount to a proposal that we go on a spending spree buying vast new armories of conventional weapons? I don't think so. I don't think we need to buy more, but I think we'll need to buy differently. The next president will have to sit down with our NATO allies and together decide on a set of assumptions for a non-nuclear defense of our vital interests. I think it'll require visionary plans for arms control and a concrete set of alternatives in case it fails. I think there's precedent for saying we can do this. It's really what we did, if you'll recall, back in the 70s, when we perceived a threat with the deployment of the Soviet SS-20s across Europe. We made a two-track decision. We confronted the Soviets with a choice. We said we'd prefer arms control. In the absence of arms control, we will deploy cruise missiles and the Pershing missile. It was a two-track policy. It was both the olive branch and the arrow. It was a successful policy because it has resulted directly in the INF treaty that we see taking shape in Europe now. I believe that the time is now at hand to go beyond that and address these issues of Soviet conventional superiority in exactly the same way. Gorbachev concedes that Soviets have a conventional advantage. And he's actually discussed the possibilities of moving toward equality by subtracting from the stronger side rather than having a buildup on our side. That was the issue with the INF missiles. And I think we ought to take him up on his offer. I think we should respond in the following fashion. We should set goals for a negotiated reduction of conventional forces on the Warsaw Pact side in Europe, and a concrete deadline for achieving it. If it doesn't work, we should take some steps of our own. We should say to the Europeans, we must build a conventional defense, and we must have quality of burden and economic sharing. We do that, I think, by negotiation, by diplomacy. And then we need to say, what steps will be needed if conventional arms control fails? I think we need three things. Conventional substitutes for tactical nuclear weapons. We must have a convincing non-nuclear answer to Soviet army. And that means using the money that we already spend on nuclear weapons to find substitutes that will do the job more effectively. What do I mean by that? Let me give you a couple of examples. The United States Army is planning to spend $1 billion for 800 nuclear artillery shells. You got those figures? $1 billion for 800 nuclear weapons. That would buy enough M1 tanks to equip a whole armored division. Or it would buy 96,000 TOW anti-tank missiles, or several million shells for the tanks that we have today. There are a lot of other ways to apply that. General Chain, the commander of the Strategic Air Command, last week suggested that the time is at hand to take the existing fleet of B-52 bombers, which aren't capable of conventional missions because they're all nuclear. He said it's time to take the B-52G series and equip them with conventional weapons. The most encouraging statement I've heard in a long time. It's a recognition from within the military that we can't continue to rely upon the threat of the early first use of nuclear weapons in Europe. We can do the same thing with readiness, spare parts, new defensive measures. I read a British historian named John Keegan, a former Minister of Defense, I believe, maybe a military historian, who said the best way to defend a piece of ground is to take a pick and shovel to it. He talks about how it is trees and artificial lakes and short retaining walls, the kinds of things you see in South Korea on our side of the DMZ, the kinds of things you see in the Middle East, in Israel. But we ought to have a real reassessment of all of those measures and how it is that we can build a conventional alternative to the instruments of retribution that we're relying upon now. Obviously, it'll take a lot of effort, but it's my idea, ultimately, of a strong defense. It rests on the imperative that national security also means national survival, and it demands of us as Americans that we do everything in our power and our policy to see that nuclear weapons, forever and always, keep the peace.